Colonel von Luger, it is the sworn duty of all officers to try to escape.
Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today, we are going to step back from my usual fare and take a look at an interesting contrast that came up in a conversation with a friend of mine recently. Basically, this has been hashed out on the internet before. I don't think I'm offering anything terribly new here, but these are my thoughts on the comparison between the style of Martin and Tolkien. So as you know, Martin wrote the Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones series, and Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, and a lot of people compare them. They also compare Martin and Lewis. Lewis did write more serious books than the Chronicles of Narnia, and Lewis even wrote a couple of a full science fiction trilogy. And I like to joke around and say that it was Martin who inspired me to write. If you've been around long enough, you might get the joke. I read the first book in the Game of Thrones series nearly 2 decades ago as a bright young college student. The story gripped me, pulled me in, and then spat me out at the end, feeling utterly repelled, like I just gorged myself on candy. I set the book down and had a good hard think. Then I made a choice. While I was reading it, I had not been able to put the book down. It was that good. I knew that if I picked up the next book, I would be unlikely to stop reading before I finished it. And there were just images in that book I didn't want to deal with. It just made me feel kind of dirty. So I decided that I would not pick up the next book. That deep overstimulation I felt, it was extremely disturbing and not something I wanted to experience again. More and more, however, I found that the science fantasy genre was trending that way. I'd grown up reveling in C.S. Lewis's fantasy and science fiction, Tolkien's high fantasy, and MacDonald's outright fantasties. Moving from that to the modern world of fantastic literature was like stepping from a cool mountain stream into a swamp. If there was a good story in those books, it was wrapped in layers designed to stimulate 3 deep-coded human reactions. That of, let's call it procreation, injustice, and violence. It really was out of spite and frustration that I sat down and started writing my own books. If there were no wholesome books in the science fantasy shelf, I was going to put them there myself. That was the birth of Dying Embers. Recent conversation with a friend who was reading Game of Thrones for the first time, however, got me thinking about what the difference actually is between Tolkien and Martin. I mean, obviously there's the sex and how it's depicted, but that isn't all. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and even their spiritual father, MacDonald, all dealt with murder, injustice, and even more abhorrent kinds of violence in their fantasy and science fiction books, and none of them repelled me the same way that Martin did. I think the difference here is how they respectively handle escapism. Both Martin and the other 3, with their depiction of twisted politics and torture. Hey, did you know that Lewis wrote a science fantasy book in his Silent Planet trilogy with a scene where a woman gets tortured? He wasn't Alphonse and Lamppost. Fun fact there. But all of these books face the facts that there are horrible things in the world. But where Martin left me with the sensation of a glutted and distended physical self unable to move, Lewis would leave me feeling grimly determined to do something about it, even if that something was simply to endure. There is a lot of talk now about realism, and how Martin's grim reveling in all the worst elements of human depravity is somehow more realistic. However, I think that it might be relevant to remember that both Lewis and Tolkien served in the trenches of World War I under some of the worst conditions known to humanity, and they volunteered in the Home Guard during World War II, living through the revelations of the excesses of all of the Axis empires. While Martin, I don't know anything about his personal history, but in all probability, he's lived the life of a pampered modern first world citizen his entire life. Any human born into a first world nation who has not had a particularly statistically unlikely childhood has, by the standards of all of human history, lived a pampered life. So saying that this product of modernity has a more realistic view of life seems to be stretching it a bit thin for me, especially when comparing him to not one, but two World War I officers. However, be their personalities and their histories what they are, all of these authors offer the reader escapism. However, I get the impression that Martin sees the escapism nature of fiction in the same way a drug addict sees drugs. Fiction is something to titillate the reader hard enough to forget the real world for the duration of the reading. This is why in his attempts at escaping, Martin fills his books with graphic depictions of procreation, graphic depictions of violence, betrayal, and injustice. These get a reaction. These titillate. These are things that human beings don't just react strongly to out of cultural training either. They are things hardwired into us to react to simply as social mammals. If our ancestors didn't react strongly to procreation, then the bloodline died out pretty fast for obvious reasons. The list of wolves, cats, and chickens that adopt offspring outside of their species goes on and on. I'm sure we've seen the research videos, or you may not have seen it, but there's a video going around of a lab monkey who throws a fit that another monkey got paid more treats for the same amount of work. Even rats have a sense of fair play, and research has shown that rats have a sense of rudimentary compassion. They'll choose to release a stranger rat from a trap, even if it means giving up a treat to do it. So when Martin dwells on the brutal and glaringly unjust murder of a small boy, he is deliberately stimulating a deep genetic code. When he graphically describes public procreation scene, he is also stimulating something fundamental. And this is titillation. By depicting these things in fiction in a safe environment, we get a taste of that fear without having to experience it in reality. And like all titillation, Martin is burdened heavily by the law of diminishing returns. An author can only get the strongest reaction to something, no matter how horrible it is, once. The first time people experience it. Then the audience just gets used to that level of stimulation, and if the attraction is simply or even primarily the stimulation itself, the medium loses its attraction. You've heard of franchise fatigue. If the author, as Martin does, depicts the brutal and unjust murder of a very young boy and a dog, and shows a 13-year-old girl taking part in a very public exhibition of, procreation, then the story as presented is not very far from the rock-bottom lowest common denominator, and that the culture accepts, and the dose of the drug of titillation has to be raised through more and more extreme scenes very quickly. Of course, one of the ways to delay the onset of the law of diminishing returns is to reset, like drug addicts who deliberately go clean for short periods of time to desensitize their brains to the drug, to resensitize their brains to the drug, to regain that reaction to the initial dose. Martin, in Book 1, seems to be trying to accomplish this with sudden shifts between the kind of the scene where a small boy child who's been carved in half suddenly switches with a scene where a different small boy child is whimsically dreaming of the name for his adopted wolf dog. So this is Martin's approach to escapism. Soak the reader in titillation, only pulling back from the stimulation of base genetic reactions long enough to reset and keep the law of diminishing returns at bay until the next book. That was what repelled me about the original books. C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, however, treated escapism very differently. Who is most exposed to escapism? Tolkien is said to have asked of Lewis once. Jailers. They often discussed how they saw fiction as escapism in terms of the soldiers and officers that they were. As we saw in the clip at the beginning of the video, when imprisoned, the video claims it was every officer's duty to escape imprisonment if for no other reason than to act as defiance against the enemy and draw their resources away from the front lines. And Lewis and Tolkien considered that they had a very serious enemy in the form of despair and its attendant symptoms of lethargy, indifference, and apathy. Their stated goals in offering escapism to their readers was to reach higher and help others to escape the mental prisons of dread, sourness, and all the negative feelings that become a self-fulfilling prophecy and make any bad situation worse. Their perspective on escapism was that you left the fruitless, self-defeating pain behind, escaped it, even if you had to take the real and unavoidable pain with you. Their books do contain all of these so-called real-world elements, the war, the violence, the injustice, even promiscuous physical relationships. For my blog readers, I will just... Anyway, for my blog readers, I will be using different words, but YouTube. However, they do not frame these as the central elements in their stories. Instead, the stories focus on the never-ending battle to be a moral agent in a world that contains these things. And because this is a story, the heroes do prevail. Yes, they prevail, but they're broken like Frodo. They make mistake after mistake and get their friends killed like Ransom. They slap face first into the realization that no matter who they are, who they think they are weak, petty, selfish creatures like Queen Oriel, whose great victory over the forces of evil is to quietly accept the wrongs she has done in her life, despite being a warrior queen who's restructured her nation. Yes, Tolkien, Lewis, MacDonald, they all offer us escape to a world where fairy queens offer deals, to a world where warrior poet aliens sing of battling their alien kraken, to a world where a humble gardener battles a giant spider with a glowing dagger. We escape to those worlds, and when we return to the mundane world, we are not left overstimulated because what we were offered was not titillation, but the growing sense of a duty. I've come to the conclusion that this Lewisian, Tolkienian, MacDonaldian escapism as a duty to maintain your mental and physical health is just a far more sustainable form of stimulation, like the endorphin rush from jogging or bicycling. But downing a massive frappuccino and riding a mile on a bike, they will both give you a rush. But when your body's done with the frappuccino, it's going to leave you crashed and craving another, whereas the bike riding endorphin high will leave you relaxed and ready for life. And again, all of this is, of course, my subjective opinion of the difference in the stories between Martin and Tolkien's contemporaries. But what do you think, my wonderful viewers? Am I being too harsh on Martin? Is there something I missed? Leave a like on the video and a comment below telling me what you think the difference is. And peace out, my wonderful viewers.